A very warm welcome to all our viewers to the 24th Knowledge Series. The Knowledge Series is an initiative wherein we have one speaker each month speaking on a variety of topics, ranging right from investing to well being. We will now have a short video of Cedrus Wealth Partners. With the buzz going around the global markets and the global US recession, what we are seeing currently, we all have many questions about the global markets, whether one should take exposure in the global markets, how will Indian markets react to the global cues, and what is the outlook for the global markets. Let us have all these questions answered today by Mr. Anthony Heredia, MD and CEO, Mahindra Manulife Investment Managers. We will now play a short video to further introduce him. A very warm welcome, sir. We all are looking forward to your views on the global macros and its impact on the Indian markets today. Without further ado, let us begin the session with Mr. Anthony. And I would now like to hand it over to Mr. Nilesh Bajaj to take the discussion forward.
Thank you, Unnati, for the wonderful introduction. Uh, and I think what better time to have this knowledge series when we have just heard from the Fed that they will slow down on the rate hikes, and the contention which most of the investors right now are having is that what impact will global markets have on the Indian economy, on the Indian markets. And I think this is the most appropriate time to have this topic on global macros and how India is interlinked with what's happening globally. Uh, Welcome, Anthony, and thank you very much for accepting our invite for being a part of the 24th edition of the Cedrus Knowledge Series.
Thank you, Nilesh. Thank you. It's a real pleasure and honor to be part of this program.
So, in fact, to just for the information of everyone, today we complete 2 years of Cedrus Knowledge Series, which began as an initiative when we could not reach out to investors during the pandemic. Just because of all the support of all the investors as well as the overall investment community, today we complete 2 years of the knowledge series, and we have continued this beyond the pandemic also because what we have realized is that the world also has changed. We don't really require to physically have interactions. We can actually virtually have interactions, and this is something which our clear intention for having the knowledge series was that the investors should understand what's happening, have relevant topics which typically are FAQ which investors ask, and that's what is our objective to have the knowledge series. In fact, so Anthony, let's start off with today's uh, topic on global macros and how it will play out in the broader scheme of things for India. In fact, so my question to you is basically, U.S. Fed has raised interest rates several times in the past few months. Yesterday was a relief when they sounded that they will slow down on the rate hikes, and that's where we saw the markets also react very positively. Uh, Besides observing the liquidity in the system, you mean to control the inflation, whereby that was the key objective of the rate hikes. uh, the US dollar has also strengthened against most of the currencies, including India. But I think, you will have a different perspective of, how Indian rupee has also fared compared to all the global currencies. Uh, so this, taking all this into account, what do you first? My first question to you is that, what would be the implication on the global economies, and how will this all play out for 2023?
Thanks, Nilesh. Interesting question, and I think very relevant because it's not just about investors having this at the top of the mind. I mean, just think about every headline or set of headlines in the media and the newspapers over the last 2-3 months. Right, they're completely focused on macro. It's something that you haven't seen for a long while. Do high inflation in developed markets, things that they are not used to, tightening of liquidity after almost a decade post the last financial crisis, that also is a significant event. The Russia Ukraine crisis, the pandemic, we're not completely out of the pandemic. There is a large neighboring country that is still dealing with it in its own unique way. So these are all going to have their implications on global growth in some form or shape. But I think from an investor standpoint or from an investing standpoint, sometimes you have to take all of this into context and then take a step back and take a little more of a longer term view. Uh, it's a large topic. I mean, you could go on for a day in terms of what this can do. But if you permit me, Nilesh, I'd be happy to kind of take all of you and your clients and viewers through a short presentation that kind of brings that into a little bit of perspective, just so that we can kind of deal with more specific questions. And I'm of course happy to kind of talk through any of the points we make on the slides as well.
Definitely, definitely. You could. The stage is yours, so you could please go ahead.
Yeah, so just give me a second to do this. If you could just let me know once it's visible to you.
Yes, Anthony, it's visible.
Thank you, Nilesh. Yeah. So, like I said, I mean, before I even start the presentation, I will just make one observation. There was a investor conference that was held in Mumbai about, I would say, 45 days ago. I unfortunately couldn't attend that conference. I was supposed to be one of the speakers, but the organizers were kind enough to send me the agenda. And one of the things that I looked at, and I frankly, in 26 years of working in the investing industry, I've never seen. They had about 10 presentations from a lot of industry marquee names of the equity fund management world presenting on their view on markets. And all of the presentations had the word macro in them. And it just struck me that I've really never seen a environment where macro has such a large role to play. And I think it's very, very pertinent, therefore, to kind of take a slightly nuanced look at it. We also have the luxury of obviously working with Manulife. So part of this is also Manulife's view. But essentially, what I think we need to think about is you look at major economies in three buckets. They're all struggling, but frankly, struggling for different reasons. I think that's important uh, to realize, because too often we kind of just think about the Fed and inflation and monetary tightening, but the issues affecting major economies are not uniform, right? For example, you look at Europe. I think when you look at economies there, the impact of energy prices, availability of energy, given their huge reliance on pipelines from Russia, have had tremendous impact on both individuals at the consumer level as well as industrial activity. And that has bearings in terms of potential disruptions in terms of manufacturing. It has disruptions in terms of consumer sentiment, etc., etc. So that, to my mind, seems to be Europe's big problem, not so much inflation or rates going up, but more energy prices. The US, on the other hand, is clearly dealing with the impact of higher rates. The Fed has been very clear that they will do whatever it takes to make sure that inflation comes off, even to the extent of at 2 or 3 months ago, the Fed chairman making a very unprecedented statement in response to a question from, I think it was a Reuters journalist, who asked him whether, do you realize that what you're doing could have a unprecedented impact on US employment? And he said, if that is, it is, which is quite a statement, right? But having said that, I think for the first 2 or 3 months when the US started to tighten rates, we didn't see an impact of that in terms of what you would expect natural consequences, right? Housing prices, auto sales, unemployment numbers, etc. But clearly, over the last 1 or 2 months, you're starting to see that impact. Housing prices are off, unemployment numbers are starting to rise, and just case in point, you look at the headlines over the last 2 weeks in terms of the massive layoffs that some of the tech giants are thinking about. This is an example of how the US is dealing with this. I think the one that we don't debate as much is China. And China is actually very uniquely placed in terms of what it can create in terms of volatility to global growth. Because I think there are virtually two different paths. One is China is probably the only major economy in the world that still is in the pandemic and therefore is looking at its economic policy in that context, right? That has implications in terms of supply chain disruptions. It has implications in terms of global demand. It has implications in terms of commodity prices, so on and so forth. On the flip side, what you would expect rationally is at some point in time, and this is some of the statements that have come out of the Chinese policymakers in the last quarter, is that they believe they are very close to the end of lockdowns. Obviously, things have changed in the last 3 or 4 weeks, but what does a China post pandemic look like? And what will it mean for the global economy? Would it mean a rise in demand? Would it mean a rise in commodity prices, therefore, a rise in inflation, therefore, a new set of problems? On the other hand, would it mean end of supply chain disruptions, etc., etc.? So, point being that three different buckets, all major, having different issues. And so, therefore, to just narrow down the conversation to interest rates and inflation, I think is a fairly is quite shallow. Just quickly, however, on rates, I mean, it's quite obvious that the policymakers have been behind the curve in terms of rates when it comes to dealing with inflation, and therefore, what you're seeing is a attempt to catch up. But in that process, one of the elements that clearly has come through, and I think we must accept that, is that global recession. I mean, there are, economics is a very complicated subject at the best of times. There are some people who would argue that we are already in a recession depending on a particular type of metric. And there will be some people who would argue that we will get into a recession. But let me just frame this in context. If you look at the economic forecast that the IMF has put out or the OECD has put out over the last couple of months, uh, it's not the number. The number is what it is, right? It is a statement that catches the eye, which is that the growth numbers or the growth profile of how projections have been are the worst growth profile since 2001, outside of the actual 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 COVID crisis. This set of numbers, and therefore this set of declining growth numbers for the globe, is the worst it has been for 20 years. So I think we must understand that in context, that we are not dealing with just a normal kind of recession in the sense, which is another argument you keep hearing, right? Yes, we will have a recession, but it will be shallow, it will be quick, we will move on. But at the same time, you look at numbers coming out and believe that there is some element of pain that yet to come. But within that, one of the other elements that has been a significant contribution to inflation has been the supply chain disruption. And what a lot of people probably haven't paid enough attention to is that if you look at this chart, you will obviously a significant disruption in supply chain pressures over the last 6 to 12 months. But interestingly, over the last quarter, those supply chain pressures have virtually come to norm, right, with a standard deviation of about 1.05. And so you would expect that if the world supply chain is returning a bit to normalcy, to some degree, growth prospects will also have a slightly greater ability to return to normalcy. So from a macro perspective, our view is the following. One, we're probably towards the end of the Fed hiking cycle, right? So, and that's something that Nilesh, you referred to, that the Fed kind of spoke to yesterday as well, which is that we expect the Fed to kind of peak at 425 and be done by the first quarter of 23. What we also think will happen is that in the process of all of this hiking to deal with inflation, we will have either recessionary conditions or other conditions, and therefore growth will suddenly become a new concern for central banks, including the Fed. And potentially, you could actually have some easing of rates even as early as 23, which is Q3 or Q4 of 23. Just bear in mind, this is calendar year, so not the fiscal year that we in India are used to. That being said, inflation aside, the tightening of the Fed balance sheet is yet to get done, right? And so, as it continues to get done, the impact of lower liquidity will have its own implications. We have to kind of be aware of that and deal with it. And to our minds, therefore, from a global market standpoint, and I want to be very careful with this, global markets, this is not Indian markets. Global market standpoint, we believe that just as people talked about 2022 being a year of extreme volatility, we would expect 23 to be the same, right? And that's the clear point that we see in global markets. Now, how does this play out from an India perspective? Now, the first thing I would say is that you need to first start thinking a little more long term, right? Uh, what does India look like in 2030? Just look at this chart. It just talks about India's role in the pecking order of world economies, right? In 2008, we were ranked number 14. And effectively, the expectation is by 2030 or thereabouts, we will be the third largest economy. Imagine the impact and the potential that being part of the world's third largest economy and the consequence in terms of the actual GDP number it represents means in terms of eventually market capitalizations, companies, businesses, opportunities. Why do people have this much conviction? It's not just about saying that India is historically grown at 5-6%, so therefore, it's logical to expect it because the world today is very different. But I think there are, to our mind, some very interesting things that have happened, especially over the last 5 years, which are very, very significant. In fact, I would believe the word significant is not the right word. It's transformational that is probably the right word. Formalization of the economy, especially post GST, is a huge driver to at least stock markets, right? Because most organized players are eventually listed companies in the market. And the more businesses in their respective sectors or subsectors that move from unorganized to organized means larger opportunities for them to grow their revenues, grow their earnings, and therefore grow their market caps. The second is digitization. Just some personal anecdote. I mean, sometimes the irony of technology is sometimes the person who adopts technology the last ends up having the best technology available. I mean, just give you a classic example, right? I mean, the person who bought a mobile phone yesterday probably has a better camera on his phone or her phone than the person who probably bought an iPhone 12, for example, 2 years ago, right? And I think the fact that India is adopting technology and digitalization in the way it has, things like UPI, things like account aggregator, these are just elements that people across the world have are not even close to replicating, right? And the implications it therefore has on the economy is significant. Now, you may say, why do I say that? Just for a moment, think not about in the COVID period, about the fact that, oh, you were still able to transfer money from a person A to person B using NEFT or UPI. Those are things that came very naturally to us. But did anybody stop to think about, oh, how come the steel manufacturers still made steel? How come the auto manufacturers still made cars? Right? There is now technology being deployed across industries, across businesses that make them very, very different businesses today as compared to they were even 5 years or 10 years ago. And we would believe this will be a continued trend. The third aspect which I want to highlight, which is something that I feel is very, very telling. India's success story over the decade of 2000 to 2010 and 2010 to 20 has been services led. Whether you look at technology, generic pharma, etc., etc. I mean, services has been the superstar. It's very clear to me that the government and policymakers are extremely passionate and driven to ensure that this decade is the rise of manufacturing. And there is a variety of initiatives, whether it is PLI, whether it is raising of duties, removal of duties, etc., etc. But the point is, there's a clear focus on import substitution. There's a clear focus on India producing quality goods that can be exported, etc. So you think about all of these three things in context, right? Digitization, formalization, and manufacturing, and you would start to imagine what the Indian economy will look at in 2030. And this chart just shows you a very fundamental truth that eventually equity markets translate GDP earnings into its own market performance, right? I mean, just take, for example, the last 15 years. You see how the GDP has grown from 410 billion to 2.2 trillion, which is 5.5 times. Market cap is 7.5 times or 7.2 times. And it's fairly counterintuitive. If the GDP grows, companies that are part of the GDP are therefore able to grow at that GDP plus inflation. That hopefully eventually translates into revenues, then into margins, then into price earnings, and therefore stock price, therefore eventual wealth creation. So if I'm not trying to plot what will happen in 2030, but it's a fair argument to say that even 2030, for argument's sake, the Indian GDP is, for argument's sake, $6 trillion or $5 trillion, then your market cap at the very least would be double, right? So just imagine today we are thinking about the fact that the markets are at a high, inflation is high, should we invest? And the point is, if I said to you, if I gave you a fairly sure chance to double your money in 6 or 7 years and probably earlier, would you take it? And I would put a caveat saying that it is going to be an extremely eventful ride, so there will be volatility. I think the outcome should convince you to do it. Just a perspective that people need to understand about our economy and the way it's kind of operating. And I don't want to risk trying to be too over optimistic, but some of these numbers are massive, right? I mean, take for example renewable energy. For a country whose big risk to equity markets or to the economy has been the over reliance on oil imports, imagine the transformation that comes through if the share of renewable energy in power rises from 22 to 41%, right? Just for example. Think about the implication of household incomes per capita rising from $5,000 US to 25,000. Think about the potential demand that it creates for companies that are in the consumption space. And you can go on and on. The last point I want to make on this subject is from an economic perspective, and I'm not going to spend too much time because I think that will be best done through an interactive session with Nilesh. Is effectively you will always. I have never presented a slide on market outlook in India over the last 25 years where there were only positives. in a marketplace there will always be pros and cons, and these are, as you can see, the cons that exist within our economy. There are pros as well, but effectively our outlook is the following: India is outperforming global markets for a reason, right? Where do you see inflation actually coming off? Where do you see growth actually being better than it was over the last 5 years? Where do you see potential for transformation? And you contrast it with my first slide that I presented, the problems that the most world economies face. It's not surprising, therefore, that equity investors feel good about being in India, and therefore the markets are at a premium. At the same time, one has to be aware, like I made the point, global macro and global growth will be a challenge for 23 for sure. And so you must be able to, in order to reap the benefits of the long term economic story, you have to be able to weather the storm. And to my mind, things like oil prices having an impact, the rupee perhaps weakening against the dollar in case the Fed raises rates again, these are all short term things. They will be dealt with given the strength in the economy. The other 2 points, which I think has become virtually a national obsession, is which sectors look good. One of the implications of the economy that we see transpiring over the next 5 years is the following. And this is a chart that talks about how sectoral performance within markets have been over the last, let's say, give or take 24, 26 months, right? I'm not going to spend too much time. I think it's very obvious from this slide that there are no permanent winners and there are no permanent losers. And so, for anybody to actually spend a huge amount of energy trying to discover which are the new themes in the market, which is the flavor of the month, flavor of the quarter, just doesn't pay. What you really need to do is focus on buying the right companies at the right value and holding it for the long term. And the last slide on the subject before I kind of go back to Nilesh is again the obsession with market caps, right? Are small caps overvalued? Are large caps underdone? Is this the time to do mid caps? Over time, you will discover that over a 5, 7, 10 year time frame, all of these capitalizations deliver returns. They come with different sets of volatility. Obviously, small cap typically delivers a higher return in the long term, but with a much higher degree of volatility. Large cap delivers perhaps the most average return of the three, but with much lesser volatility and much higher predictability. The point being that you can have a mix of all of this, you just be diversified and not really. I think the point I would make in conclusion is, do not focus on the short term, do not focus on what sectors look good, do not focus on which capitalizations look good. Beyond a point, do not focus on the world's macro issues. Focus on what clearly seems to be an outstanding India economic opportunity for the next decade, and remain invested so that you take advantage. So I'm going to stop sharing, Nilesh, and over to you. Nilesh, you're on mute, I think.
Thank you. I actually didn't realize. Yeah. So what I was asking you was that this was a wonderful perspective on the global macros and how they will plan out for India specifically, and what should investors do. And I think a few of the relevant answers which you gave are something which the investors do keep asking, that whether we should invest in large caps, mid caps, small caps, or whether we should invest in some sector specific investments, okay, or whether we need to invest in some specific themes. And I think your presentation did clarify that if we need to look at the broader perspective than just look at specific, in fact, market specifics. But a few questions, Anthony, is what is your view on the geopolitical issues which we are seeing, be it the war in Ukraine which is going on, or be it the China Taiwan tiff which is happening. Uh, do you feel that's a risk? I know it's a little tough question to answer because no one can predict what will happen. But what is the risk we are carrying actually on the geopolitical front?
So, Nilesh, it's a great question because the point is each of these elements can play out in sometimes virtually opposite directions, right? So, for example, you talked about geopolitics. Now, the easy answer to say is that, oh no, now what's new? We know the Russia-Ukraine crisis. It's almost close to a year. I think we've moved on. But how many people know that on the 4th of December, there are a new set of sanctions that now cut off the loophole? We Indians are used to this word jugad, right? So lots of people said, no, 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 we are not taking money, oil from Russia. It's coming via something. And so, therefore, from 4th of December, as you may know, effectively, any transportation of oil from Russia, any refining of oil from Russia is also liable to sanction, which then puts an end to the fact that Europe was still consuming that oil, except that saying that no, no, I don't take oil from Russia, but they take oil from some refiner in China or some refiner in India. So that's going to stop. Now, funnily enough, the economies and markets have reacted positively for now, because their view is that, because it's counterintuitive. You would think that if you are no longer going to be able to buy cheap oil from Russia, then I have to buy oil only from the remaining people. Oil price should go up. That's not good. So why are people happy? Their view is that given the rest of what is happening in terms of interest rate hikes, inflation, recessionary fears, demand has collapsed to a point where frankly something like this is only going to take us closer to the fact that oil prices will remain where they are, and hopefully it brings closer to Russia Ukraine, because it gives Russia one less lever that they were happily on their laughing their way to the bank. So the point is, these can play out in different fashions, and the idea as a portfolio manager needs to be that just remain alive to it, because it will have a different implication for an energy producing company. It may have a different implication for a paint company, right? I mean, so the aspect of geopolitical or global issues is something that is, I would say, in 23 the most vital item. I'll give you a simple example. The kind of easing of the shortage of chips in the last 2 quarters has been so significant, it could have major implications for auto manufacturers, their ability to manufacture, because as we all know from auto numbers and the waiting period for cars, demand is certainly not an issue, right? It's supply and manufacturing. And just imagine a situation where if you say I am not worried about global, and you take your eye off the ball to think that chip shortage is actually no longer an issue to the extent it was, and then you could have some auto companies post some great numbers because they're just manufacturing more. So to my mind, all of these things, I just would caveat and conclude by saying every global risk will create an opportunity. And as a equity optimist, the idea is to therefore buy the opportunity and exit the risk. That's the way I would look to play it. And let the fund manager do it. So as an investor, I think the role of the investor is to remain invested with the right people. As long as you're invested with the right people for the right time frame, life is good.
No, I think that's very well said. That we need to move on. We have already moved on. It's been almost a year now since the Ukraine war started, and Taiwan is something which keeps coming and going. And China is somewhere where there are issues which are going on. In fact, uh, my next question actually, this is not related to the equity markets. It's more to do with what's happening on the interest rate front. In fact, in India also, because Fed raised interest rates due to inflation, which is a reality in US. India, it was more of people talk about imported inflation. Most of the inflation is imported, in fact. Do you feel that this is more to do with fixed income? You have seen rate hikes which happened in India also. I think it's about 1.9% of RBI raised interest rates in the last 1 year. Not 1 year, also 6 months. Uh, do you feel it's a great opportunity for someone who is, who wants a fixed income, in the sense that he wants safety, to invest in a debt-related instrument, citing that, because it's a imported inflation, the interest rates also can come down the way they have gone up sooner or later. So, could you give us some perspective on this?
So, Nilesh, I'm going to give you a very dumb answer, but I think the dumb answer allows me to kind of relate it to something that investors in fixed income are so used to, which is, when do you feel the most happy when you go to a bank to place a bank deposit? It is when you place a 5 year or a 7 year or a 10 year bank deposit at the highest rate possible that you have seen from this bank in the last 5 years, right? I mean that, and the converse is true, right? You actually have a deposit that was paying you, let's say for argument's sake, 9%, and you go to your bank because it has now matured, and you suddenly discover, oh my god, it's only now 5% for 5 years, right? And you say, this is really and for a lot of people, that, given their asset allocation needs, etc., fixed income has to be part of their lives. Now, effectively, I would say this: I think you're going to get the best long-term bank fixed deposit rates in the first 6 months of 23, which means common sense would indicate that you should go long and you should lock in your long-term fixed deposits. And that would also say that for the more knowledgeable investors, you should therefore be brave and smart enough to buy the long-term bond fund, because over 3 to 5 years, that's when you're going to make returns, because eventually interest rates will come off over those 3 to 5 years, right? There's an interesting, I don't have that slide to pull up right now, but we have done some interesting statistical work, Nilesh. It just basically takes the most popular word, SIP. So we said, if you did a 3 year SIP in the 10-year gilt, what is your kind of return? And we've historically found that when the last 3 year SIP return on gilt is at its lowest, it has then meant an absolute performance over the next 3 to 5 years, which is the highest. And
Mhm.
for the last 15 years, I may share with you that your 3 year and 5 year gilt SIP is effectively yielding a return which is not even savings bank rate, which would then indicate, at least as far as past history is concerned, if you have the courage and the foresight, this is the time to go long. Now,
Mhm.
some people say, I will go long, but I think, you just said Fed is going to raise to 4.25. RBI also will raise 1 or 2 times more. So I'll wait for that opportunity. And I will also tell you out of experience, waiting for the perfect moment in investing is, a task in futility. Nobody has ever found success in that. So my advice to investors would be, over the coming quarters, especially as you find fixed income needs to be part of your portfolio, this is the time to go long.
Mhm. No, wonderful. I think, it will definitely help a lot of investors take the right decision. Uh, Thank you, Anthony. I think this was a wonderful session, whereby we have got a view which I'm sure a lot of investors will definitely appreciate. Uh, uh, the thing is, some points which, before I want to wind up, is that one, we are very obsessed with US, but there are issues going on in other economies also. We need to have a look at that. Uh, the second part is basically that uh, related to the global geopolitical issues. Uh, we don't see too much of issue over there, and that is something which, we can just give it a pass right now, because that's something which we cannot predict, in fact. The third part is, do not look at market capitalization. It's better to stay invested in the right sectors at the right time. And sector rotation is something which I which you have mentioned, is something which is going to keep playing out in the markets, and that is something which apparently leaves the point that we should not be too obsessed with small cap, mid cap, large cap. I think it's better to just be in India. In fact, uh, I think these are a few of the key takeaways which I feel will definitely help investors. Uh, Unnati, over to you with your closing remarks. Thank you very much, Anthony, for your time.
Thank you, Nilesh, once again for the opportunity.
That was a very interesting session, sir. Thank you so much for your views, and I'm sure this advice, what you've given, will help us to plan strategies for investors and our investors also for taking the right decision going forward. I'll just move to the audience Q&A. The first question from the audience Q&A is, will commodity prices cool off in the near term? And what is your outlook on the commodity prices?
So, as I mentioned earlier, our base case assumption is commodity prices will remain range bound over the next year or so. Uh, but I think the two elements that can change the dynamic, like I referred to, how does the 4th December new sanction actually play out, especially in terms of oil? I think we have to wait and watch for reality to happen. Right now, markets expect something to happen, and now markets expect things to be good. But I think there is common sense logic that suggests that if oil availability is constrained because Russia is no longer able to deliver, then it can have a converse impact. And China, like I said, just imagine for us today what is happening. The Chinese manufacturing part of the economy in the last quarter or so has come back. And they are manufacturing, but Chinese demand domestically is low because of lockdown. So they are dumping commodities and manufactured goods in the marketplace, which is helping to cool off inflation. But just imagine a scenario where one quarter from now, China changes its policy, and unlike other economies or democracy, it is possible in China for policies to dramatically change overnight, and suddenly you have domestic demand, pent up demand coming through, and commodity prices could rise. So my answer is that it there are these two risks that could cause a spike in commodity prices, but our base case is that commodity prices will be range bound through 2020.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for the valuable inputs. And I would like to thank you and Mahindra Manulife for making the time to place this event. We'll return next month with a new topic and a new speaker. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you.
Thank you, Nilesh.